declare that some plants have thorns is perhaps about as obvious a statement as saying that some ponds have fish or some skies have clouds. I believe it is safe to say that virtually every person has, at some point or another, had an unpleasant encounter with some point or another on a painfully pointed plant. Indeed, thorns and their associated plants are often seen in various stories and tales, myths and legends, fables and parables. They are sometimes regarded as a sort of metaphor for trials or pains that are a part of life. Treading a thorny path is a familiar enough idea to anybody who has lived long enough. Even so, I doubt that most people consider the actual thorns in reality all that deeply, at least beyond the realization that they are sharp and likely best avoided, or even removed in some cases. While this is understandable and largely practical, I believe there is value in looking more deeply into things, even things that seem quite familiar and commonplace. So let us take a little while to consider a few curious cases of pointed plant life, and see what happens when vegetation grows claws. To begin with, the purpose of thorns should be reasonably evident even upon passing consideration. Plants tend to be eaten by various herbivores, and it is not typically in the plant's best interest to be consumed. Even if the regular browsing or grazing removes only a fraction of the leaves and stems, these losses still need to be replaced by new growth. The plant that is eaten less is the plant that tends to thrive more. To this end, plants have developed many interesting defensive mechanisms. The plants have no option to run away, as uprooting themselves is generally out of the question. The lack of conventional muscle tissue or nervous systems also presents something of a limitation to locomotion. Still, there are other means of self-defense. One of the most common and varied is the development of a wide range of chemical substances. There are sophisticated poisons, many of which have been adapted to use as medicines or spices, or somewhat more illegal substances. There are other compounds that may not be especially toxic, but might instead simply taste bad. Still others tend to play havoc with immune systems, leading to massive allergic reactions. The variations seem almost infinite. Then there are the mechanical defenses. Some plants invest in thick coverings of bark or incorporate abrasive silicates into their tissues to make a tougher meal. Finally, we come to the thorns. About the only constants in thorns are that they are sharp enough to break skin, they are stiff enough to hold their form as they do so, and they sprout from plants. Within these parameters, they may be needle-like or conical, straight or curved, minuscule or massive, singular or clustered, or even branching. Even the sources and origins of thorns can vary considerably from plant to plant, depending upon how generous the botanist is with their definitions. Thorns may arise as parts of stems or leaves, buds or roots. Virtually any part of a plant is a potential point of origin. However, if we want to be proper and technical, we must familiarize ourselves with at least 3 terms that are commonly used almost interchangeably. These terms are thorn, spine, and prickle. If we are being proper and accurate with our terminology, thorns are modifications of shoots. In other words, they are stems that are specialized into pointed shapes for defense. Spines, on the other hand, are modified leaves, whether entire leaves or merely portions thereof. Prickles are modifications of the epidermis of the plant. Unlike proper thorns and spines, they do not have cores of vascular tissue, and thus are often relatively easy to remove. For today, I will not be holding strictly to these technical definitions. If a pointy plant projection seems more spine-like, I will call it a spine regardless of whether it might actually be a thorn or a prickle. The same goes for the other terms. To make things all the more confusing, there are many plant species with leaves that have sharp points along their edges. Holly is a particularly well-known example of this, and the leaves of a holly tree can be every bit as pointed and painful as any briar or bramble. Talking of briars and brambles, it may be worth taking a moment or two to define just what these plants actually are. Once again, the common use allows for virtually any thorny plant to be called a briar or a bramble, more or less interchangeably. However, by some definitions at least, the terms briar and bramble refer to very specific plants. The former, the briars, are varieties of wild rose bushes that are thorny enough to be generally avoided. Brambles, on the other hand, are varieties of blackberry, which tend to take the form of tangles of creeping vines more than proper shrubs. The fact that both of these types of plant are in the same family makes their distinction perhaps a little more ambiguous at times. The armaments on both brambles and briars can be formidable, making them valuable refuges for smaller animals that can slip between all the sharp points. However, there are other plants that are positively bristling with spines. One of these in particular may be found in the lowland forests of Cascadia. In the deeper and more primeval parts of these evergreen forests, the sun filters down through the canopy as little more than a suggestion of proper daylight. Still, it is light enough to support the growth of spectacular ferns and other plants specialized for living in the shade. A visitor to the deeper and more undisturbed parts of these forests may find a quite singular sort of plant among the undergrowth. It grows upright, usually about as tall as a person, though larger specimens can reach up to 5 meters in height. The plant has remarkably large leaves that may easily grow to more than a foot across, with palmately lobed shapes not unlike what one sees in maple leaves. Such leaves are excellent for capturing light and well suited for the secluded environment of a deep forest. They are somewhat thin and delicate compared to many other leaves. In a more open place, such leaves would probably be torn to pieces over time by wind and other weather. Even in the depths of the forest, there are creatures that would happily browse on such fare. However, these particular leaves are quite sharply protected. Arrays of needle-like spines arise from the leaf veins both above and below, and the petiole, or stalk of the leaf, is entirely covered with a dense coating of these defensive structures. The stems are similarly covered in these spines. As one might have surmised, these spines are probably better regarded as prickles in the technical botanical sense. However, looking at them, the term spine seems a good deal more accurate. The plant is so aggressively defended by these spines that it is reflected in its name. The scientific name is Oplopanax horridus, which roughly translates to horrible armored healing. A bit strange as names go, until one realizes that Panax is the genus of plants commonly called ginseng. So another interpretation may be horrible armored ginseng. A synonym for this particular species would be Echinopanax horridus, or horrible spiny ginseng. The common name is devil's club. Despite its rather vicious spines, or perhaps because of them in some cases, this plant has been used in a number of traditional medicines and ceremonies by many tribes native to the region. In some traditions, hanging a piece of devil's club over a doorway is said to ward off evil. Honestly, the sight of such a spiny decoration might ward off quite a number of visitors, whether evil or not. Moving to the other side of the continent, we find a tree with a rather curious common name. The honey locust is familiar to many residents from the American Midwest to the East Coast. It can be found as far south as Mexico. The scientific name is Gleditsia triacanthos. The genus name refers to an 18th century German botanist with the surname of Gleidig. This species name roughly translates to 3 spines. These plants are in the legume family, and as such their root systems are associated with symbiotic nitrogen-fixing bacteria. This makes them grow quite vigorously, even in relatively poor soil. Some might note that these particular plants lack the characteristic root nodules seen in many other legume species. However, it would appear that there are still symbiotic associations taking place, given the rapid growth patterns and certain research findings. Moving back above the ground, one can see a structural feature shared with a great many legumes. The fruits of the honey locust are essentially seed pods, not altogether unlike what one sees in beans or peas. The tree's common name most likely refers to the relatively sweet pulp found within the mature seed pods. Both this pulp and the seeds themselves are edible. I should note that there are close relatives of the honey locust that have seed pods that are quite poisonous, so it really wouldn't be a good idea to just go sampling seed pods off of random trees. As interesting as the other aspects of this plant may be, it is the thorns that are perhaps its most memorable feature. They grow in branching clusters, with individual thorns typically ranging from 1 to 4 inches in length. However, some of these thorns may grow past 8 inches in length. They tend to be green and fairly soft at first, before hardening and turning into a reddish-brown color. Eventually, they fade into more of a gray hue as the tissues die and they become relatively brittle. Brittle or not, these thorns are not to be trifled with. It is not uncommon to see a honey locust trunk completely veiled in clusters of these branching thorns, a remarkably aggressive armament that carries something of a mystery. After all, what on earth could such vicious defenses actually be defending against? The prevailing theory at this point is that these thorns are the echoes of a bygone age. The honey locust evolved them millennia in the past to ward off the browsing depredations of Ice Age megafauna. The large browsers have since gone extinct, but the honey locust has yet to lose its thorns, at least for the most part. There are a few cultivars that happen to be thornless, and these are sometimes favored as ornamental trees for gardening and landscaping purposes. A similarly vicious sort of defense may be found on an altogether different sort of plant native to the deserts of the American Southwest. The so-called jumping cholla is a variety of cactus with a particularly nasty habit of going all to pieces. Unfortunately, each of these pieces is covered with barbed spines. If a person even casually brushes against any part of this cactus, it is quite likely that the spines will embed themselves in the person's clothing. That is, if they are fortunate. If they are less fortunate, the spines are embedded in their skin. Each spine is covered in tiny backward-pointing barbs, which make it relatively difficult to remove. In addition, the connections between the spines and their underlying cactus stem, and the connection between the spines and their unfortunate victim, are typically stronger than the connection between the cactus stem and the nearby bit of adjacent cactus stem. Thus, a chunk of cactus tends to break off quite readily to be carried by whatever creature touched the plant until it is able to extract the spines from its hide. Despite this horror, the fruits produced by this cactus are important food sources for local wildlife, particularly during times of drought. There is another possible animal association beyond this, though. The propensity for detachment might be more than a mere defensive measure. After all, it is possible for the bits of severed stem to begin to grow into new plants should they fall onto a patch of suitable ground. Some people have theorized that the jumping cholla used to employ the extinct megafauna of the Ice Age as carriers of these stem fragments. Larger creatures with dense coverings of fur might not have been especially troubled by these viciously barbed spines, as such structures would not have reached the underlying skin. Instead, they would be carried about in a manner not unlike that of some of the burrs that cover certain types of seeds, adhering to the coats of animals for a time before eventually falling off, having been carried some fair distance in the process. It would seem that thorns often find themselves in the middle of the associations between plants and animals. Another example of quite thorny plants would be the acacias commonly found in the African savanna. A classic example of this would be the species Vachellia tortilis, the umbrella thorn acacia. These trees grow into expansive shapes that vaguely resemble open umbrellas. Their thorns, one would suppose, present an insurmountable barrier to would-be herbivores. Alas for the acacias, this is not quite the case. To begin with, there is no shortage of insect species that are quite capable of picking away at the leaves as they crawl between the thorns. However, there is at least one larger animal that is adapted remarkably well to dining on even the thorniest of fare. The giraffe is a quite distinctive and familiar creature. I trust I do not need to provide a description here. What many people are not aware of is the singular adaptations associated with the giraffe's mouth. The teeth are relatively long, and the interior of the mouth is virtually armor-plated. The lips are quite tough and prehensile, and the tongue is remarkably long and quite tough as well. In addition, it is coated with particularly thick mucus. All of these adaptations taken together mean that a giraffe can happily munch on the thorny branches of acacias without any particular discomfort. Amusingly enough, the thorns in this case never stood a chance. Still, acacias are not without alternatives. There are several species of so-called swollen thorn acacias, which have thorns that are considerably thicker than those of their close relatives. Indeed, such thorns may often be thicker than the stems that bear them. One example of this would be Vachellia drepanolobium, sometimes called the whistling thorn. The thorns in this species tend to occur in pairs, and although they have the sharp apex typically seen in thorns, their bases are swollen to the point of being nearly spherical. They are also hollow. One might wonder about the purpose of such a strangely modified thorn. The purpose becomes clear enough when one sees just what is living on these particular plants. The whistling thorn is host to colonies of ants. Species vary from tree to tree, but the overall pattern is similar regardless. A colony of ants takes up residence in the tree, and the workers bore holes in the hollow thorns. These thorns then become nest chambers. When the wind is just right, the air moving over these holes gives rise to a whistling sound, giving the plant its common name. Now, even a giraffe, despite its singularly armored mouth, is not going to enjoy a horde of angry, stinging ants suddenly rushing up its snout and over its face. Thus, the acacias that host the right sorts of ant colonies tend to be left alone for the most part. There is another curious association of insects with thorns, seen in the tree hoppers of the family Membracidae. These little insects have piercing mouthparts and live on a diet of sap from whatever plants they happen to be hopping about on. Though details vary from species to species, their bodies often take on quite fantastical shapes. In many cases, these shapes are a close mimicry to the curved prickles often seen on plant stems. One clear example of this form is the aptly named thorn bug, Umbonia crassicornis. In this little insect, the front dorsal plate of the thorax, also known as the pronotum, is greatly expanded. It is drawn upwards into a curved spine and back over the body in a fairly smooth curve. The overall effect of this is a body shape that is remarkably similar to the sort of thorn one might see on a rosebush. In effect, at least some of the membracids appear to be thorn mimics, a handy bit of mimicry in that they resemble not only plant structures, but particularly plant structures that most creatures would tend to avoid. Then again, there are at least a few creatures that do not avoid thorns. Beyond the ants that use hollow thorns as nests, there are other creatures that find decidedly more grisly uses for them. Many naturalists are captivated by birds, seeing the bright colors and hearing the sweet melodies of at least certain species. Bird watching is a time-honored tradition in many parts of the world, and birds often have considerable cultural significance. With all of this glamour, it is sometimes easy to forget that birds are essentially dinosaurs that lost their teeth and took to a life on the wing. Anybody who has kept chickens can attest to the singular viciousness of birds under the right conditions. Deep down, I suspect that the feathery fiends have never quite forgotten what manner of creatures they evolved from. Enter the shrike. There are several species of shrike in the family Linneidae. They are unassuming birds at a glance, ranging in size from something close to a sparrow to perhaps a crow. A hint as to their somewhat disturbing nature may be found in their names. The family name Linneidae and the genus name Linnaeus both roughly translate into butcher. As far as common names are concerned, the shrikes are also known as butcher birds for their singularly macabre habits. In most shrike species, there is a marked tendency to store prey. Males in particular seem to do this, perhaps as an advertisement to potential mates. The corpses of their victims are stored by impalement upon the thorns of available plants. It may be worth noting that, for some shrikes at least, any sharp object will suffice. Even barbed wire may be put to similar uses. Regardless of the details, a shrike's territory typically includes a few food stores in the form of impaled corpses. This is gruesome enough in the case of smaller species which tend to hunt down and feed upon insects. It grows more troubling in the larger species. One especially disturbing example is the great gray shrike, Lanius excubator. The name roughly translates to the sentinel butcher. This might refer to its tendency to sometimes hunt by perching in the highest spot available to look for suitable prey. As for the prey in question, the great gray shrike is quite likely to take small birds, reptiles, and mammals. One can readily imagine the sorts of displays these predators tend to accumulate in their macabre little larders. This species has even been known to mimic the calls of smaller songbirds at times to lure them in. Though these shrikes lack the claws of proper birds of prey, their beaks are hooked and sufficient to kill when applied properly to a small vertebrate skull. It is worth noting that the impalement does serve a purpose beyond that of display or storage. It also secures the bird's meal in place. As a shrike lacks the grasping claws seen in the raptors, it needs to use other methods to hold the prey steady while it tears off pieces in the normal course of dining. It is a strange thing to consider, and not at all uncommon in the natural world. A feature developed by one organism for one purpose may be used by another sort of creature for an altogether different purpose. Sometimes, when plants grow claws, that is only the beginning. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed today's little foray into the unknown. If you are still curious and wish to venture a little further, here are a few things you might consider looking into. If you found this video enjoyable, do feel free to leave a like. If you believe others might enjoy it, by all means, share. If you wish to see more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite helpful. Until next time.